Thank you very much for joining in for today's session. In this session, we are going to have a conversation around Kenya's conflict transformation agenda following the 2007 electoral conflict. Now, Kenya has continued to experience electoral conflict, especially following the period after the reintroduction of multi-party democracy elections in Kenya in 1991. Now, in 1992, we had electoral conflict that was largely based on land issues, and this was repeated in 1997 elections, where we, as a country, witnessed ethnic kind of electoral-based conflicts across the country, especially in the Rift Valley, central parts of Kenya, and down in coastal region. Now, this was repeated elsewhere in 2007, where the country almost disintegrated as a result of the disputed 2007 presidential election results. Following the pronouncement of the results, there was that outbreak of violence, spontaneous, sometimes referred as organized violence that was experienced again in the Rift Valley, the central parts of the country down the coast, as well as in Nairobi. And following the 2007 violence, the local actors, the domestic actors, were unable to resolve this conflict, and this attracted international interventions that occasioned the interventions by the African Union panel of eminent personalities. The United Nations was equally involved, and following this, in negotiations, this culminated in the signing of the National Accord and Reconciliation Act on February 28th, 2008, and this paved the way for peace and stability in the country. Now, after the signing of the National Accord, there were a series of interventions that were initiated in the country by both state and non-state actors. We had interventions by peace-building IGOs in the country, for instance, the United Nations Development Program. We had interventions by the business and private sector, specifically the case of Kenya Private Sector Alliance in their program, Kenya Daima. We had so many other interveners, for instance, the likes of faith-based interventions. For instance, key agencies involved in peace building in the country include the Catholic Church, specifically the Catholic Justice and Peace Building and Peace Commission, CJPC. We had other actors, for instance, media agencies. We had international media organizations, for instance, the BBC running the SEMA Kenya program. We had other agencies, for instance, the Internews Network, with that program on land-based, conflict-sensitive reporting, on peace reporting. We had other actors, advocacy and activism agencies, for instance, the case of the United States Agency for International Development, involved in programs on the Kenya civil society, strengthening, conflict mitigation interventions. We also had other interventions by other actors. For instance, the financing agencies, in this case, the United Nations Peace Building Fund, not forgetting the role played by academia and research, the role played by other agencies, for instance, judicial interventions, in this case, the International Criminal Court, other domestic kind of, internationalized interventions, the case of the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And all these, interventions were geared towards advancing the conflict transformation agenda in Kenya. Of course, other local actors largely involved in the quest for conflict transformation, starting with the National Steering Committee on Peace Building and Conflict Management, which serves as the central unit of organizing interventions around conflict transformation in the country. The National Steering Committee, working with other state and non-state actors, initiated interventions across the country at the national level, at the district levels, now counties, what we had the district peace committees, down into the grassroots level. and the local peace committees, and these many other actors, both state and non-state, at the national, at the district, now counties, down into the local peace committees at grassroots, worked in interventions or in programs that basically sought to advance the quest for conflict transformation in the country with a view to attaining peace and stability, and constraining future relapse into violence in the country. Now, these many actors in the period from 2008 initiated interventions in different intervention spaces, largely in places, especially in the Rift Valley, where we had more of the epicenter of the electoral conflict. These interventions were initiated elsewhere in Nairobi, especially in the informal settlements, the likes of Kibera, Mathare. We had other interventions initiated across the central parts of the country and down in the coastal region by many state and non-state agencies. This aimed at advancing the quest for conflict transformation in the country. Of course, financing agencies, donor agencies played a critical role in funding the intervention programs, the likes of the UNDP, the likes of the USAID, financing interventions within different intervention spaces in the country. And the period from 2008 or through to around 2013, there was that intensified agenda by the country, by the state, by the National Steering Committee, by other non-state and state actors to advance the conflict transformation agenda in the country. Review of data would show how many intervention programs were initiated in places like Eldoret, in places like Kisumu, with a view to even in Nakuru, with a view to advancing the quest for building cohesion in the country. Of course, the country the government initiated structured interventions. For instance, the promulgation of a new constitution, the Constitution of Kenya 2010, that instituted structural reforms across the country. Of course, other institutions were established, the likes of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, trying to advance the integration agenda in the country. Religious agencies, specifically notable is the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission, led by the Reverend Cornelius Correo, specifically in North Rift, especially in the program Amani, Mashinani, coming up with several interventions, putting up connector projects across some parts of Rift Valley, which was defined as the epicenter of the conflict. And so that continued agenda by the state, led by the National Steering Committee, other projects by the UNDP, working in collaboration with the state in key programs, specifically the Uwiano program. Or many of these programs work towards advancing the conflict transformation agenda. And this was observed until 2013, where we saw the elections running a little smoothly. We didn't experience really large scale incidences of electoral violence. Actually, there were not reported serious cases of electoral violence during the 2013 elections, simply because of that infrastructure for peace that was developed in the country after the 2007 elections, following the signing of the National Accord. And it is of import for us, bodies as interested actors in the peace building agenda in the country, to have to track the interventions of these actors and how these actors have continually advanced the conflict transformation agenda. Look at the agencies, critical agencies as the National Steering Committee on Peace Building and Conflict Management, the infrastructure for peace interventions that they put across the country, the district peace committees, now county peace security committees, the local peace committees, those grassroots interventions that were initiated by IGOs, by NGOs, by faith-based organizations, by local grassroots communities, women-age organizations, youth actors, with a view to understanding how these interventions managed to advance the quest for peace in Kenya. And I would say in 2013, the results for these interventions were evident. But in the period after the 2013 elections, we saw a kind of a fizzling down of the interventions for peace. These interveners left the country to other intervention spaces, financing or funding towards the conflict and transformation agenda in the country went a little bit down compared to what the interventions, the funding we had after the 2007 violence and the interventions thereafter. And again, media agencies kind of stopped reporting on these interventions for peace across the country. We had programs like Sema Kenya program, coming to an end, the Internews networks programs on peace and conflict reporting. So the conflict transformation agenda had a huge milestone in the country after the 2007 elections, but now after the 2013 elections, there were not, intensive interventions programs geared towards advancing the conflict transformation agenda in the country. And of course, in 2017, there was that relapse into violence in some parts of the country, largely Nairobi, in some parts of Nyanza, parts of Migori and Kisumu. And I would say, well, the violence experience, spontaneous violence experience in these parts of the country were not of any, huge intensity as observed in 2007. That's now a pattern of relapse into violence in the country, especially during elections, is of a concern to us as interested actors in the peace building agenda in the country, in the conflict transformation agenda in the country. Conversations around restorative and retributive justice for victims of electoral violence, victims of historical injustice, discourses around transitional justice, retributive justice for perpetrators of these atrocities committed in 2007, earlier historical injustice, 1992, 1997, questions raised around the ICC process in Kenya, the TJRC report that was presented to the president, yet to be debated at the National Assembly, the failure to establish a reparations framework, the implementation committee for the report. These are some of the challenges that have constrained the conflict transformation agenda in the country. And it is of import for us as interested actors in the peace building agenda in the country to continually have these conversations, asking questions about historical injustice, asking questions about implementation of critical agencies like the TJRC report. Recently, in 2018, we saw that handshake between President Kenyatta and Prime Minister Raila Odinga, the Building Bridges initiative that was geared towards, bringing integration in the country, discussions around the 50% plus one agenda, the win-win, and how such would attract conflict in the country, especially during elections. These are concerns that as interested actors in the conflict transformation agenda in Kenya, we need to keep asking ourselves, how are we doing as a country? Why is it that the conflict transformation agenda is appearing to be fizzling down? Especially when we see interveners leaving the intervention spaces, we see reduced coverage on peace interventions across the country. Yet again, around elections, we see that heightened, attention towards peace and conflict in the country, the sustainability of these interventions for peace in the country, narratives around continued interference by actors, both state and non-state, narratives around regime change interests of these international actors, continued arguments about gatekeeping, where we have several non-governmental organizations, well-established ones, having control over some intervention spaces in the country, deciding on who receives funding from international agencies and where these intervention programs would be initiated, and who would be the beneficiaries. It's important for us to continually have these conversations as a people, as a nation, if we need to have a continued agenda for peace in our country. And this is the agenda of this conversation we are having, with a view to tracking how far we've gone as a country towards achieving the agenda for reconciliation, for integration in our beloved country, Kenya. And so therefore, narratives around historical injustice, how far have we done? We've seen the government initiating some structured programs around resettlement of IDPs, government buying huge trucks and resettling previous cases of displacements. We have the displacements for 92, displacements in 97, displacements in 2007. The three-tier typology, historical injustice in the country, from independence, colonial times, independence, to the multi-party era, to the National Accord era. It's important for us to continually have this conversation, because it is in having this conversation we will be in a good position as a people to move forward as one cohesive nation, to enhance the integration and eventually have effective conflict transformation in the country. And so it is important that we keep asking these questions. What is the agenda of the government and the state towards effective conflict transformation in the country? What's the agenda of the state? How much of government's funding is geared towards addressing historical injustice, resolving those structural inequalities that have continually advanced, discourses around electoral conflict, electoral injustices in the country. What conversations are we having around implementing programs like the TGRC, which were funded by state and non-state actors, by international agencies, with a view to attaining effective conflict transformation in Kenya? It is in continually asking these many questions, in tracking down these interventions across the country, different regions, reviewing the infrastructure for peace in Kenya. That is, a people will be in a good position to keep track of what we are doing as a country. Of course, engaging these many non-state actors, looking at the place of the media in advancing the peace discourse in the country, looking at the place of faith-based actors, the private sector, advocacy and activism agencies, financing agencies, the judicial interventions. How can we, engage these multi-track actors, both state and non-state actors, to ensure that there is, effective conflict transformation in Kenya? This is the conversation that we need to continually have, continually as a people. Ask these questions, ask the academia, ask the faith-based organizations, ask the peace-building NGOs and IGOs, ask the state, specifically the National Steering Committee. Remember that policy they came up with on peace-building and conflict management in 2011. How effective has it been in advancing the conflict transformation agenda in Kenya? Is this policy advancing the infrastructure for peace in the country? What are the gaps? What are the challenges facing the conflict transformation agenda? And of course, what opportunities exist to ensure that we do not experience those relapses into electoral conflict, into ethnic discourses that may eventually lead us to experiences that we had in 2007. So as a people, interested actors in the peace building agenda, we need to continually keep asking these questions. reviewing available data, reviewing these available reports, the likes of the Kiliku report, the Akiwumi report, the Ndungu report, the Waki-CPEV report. We had the Kriegler Commission report, the DGRC, really, I think 4 or 5 volumes of the DGRC report, and most recently the BBI report was a really nice report that was produced to see what can we gain out of these reports. Can we implement these reports? Why is it that it has taken long for the government to consider implementing these reports? And what would be the opportunities for us as a people in implementing these reports for us to attain effective conflict transformation in the country? It is of import for us to keep asking these questions. Maybe in the end we'll find some answers. Maybe in the end we'll have a structured conversation that will help us as a people attain effective conflict transformation for peace and the posterity of this our great nation. So that's where we end up tonight or today's session. Thank you very much.